America, as we have known it for our entire lives, except for the past 8 years, is dead, and it's not coming back. Let me clarify and apologize in advance for Jay David at Red State, because he conflates the terms constitutional republic and democracy indiscriminately. As we all know, or as those who know anything about constitutional originalism and the founding of this country know, the founders gave us a republic, not a democracy. They never meant for this country to be a democracy. So when you hear frequent use of the term American democracy, just understand that means the American constitutional republic that used to exist but does no longer. Now look around the world today and one sees the emergence of strongman rulers in nations of various political stripes. We often like to call it populism, but is it really? And if so, what is causing the spread of populism around the world? At the forefront of these movements is a strong man ruler. And when you hear the term populism, think democracy. And then remember what the Founding Fathers warned us about democracy and why they intended to give us a constitutional republic. One in which the people's power was also limited, because they didn't trust the people any more than they trusted factions or government either. We can find some commonalities and relate them to the United States. In Eastern Europe, it revolves around a sense of national sovereignty and especially affects the middle class, who find themselves in a precarious situation which they blame ignorantly on globalization personified by the European Union. In Asia, whose democracies are considerably younger and who have largely benefited from globalization, it is the growing middle classes who clamor for protection through a tough leader and a stop to placating minorities and Western cultural influences. For example, Hindu nationalism in India is on the rise. South Korea has a president who rules with an iron fist, and the Philippines now has a president who openly endorses death squads and, by the way, is a big fan of Donald J. Trump. The situation in the United States isn't really all that different. The dynamics definitely share some factors. Here it is broadly the middle class, but with a racial component thrown in. In effect, they perceive themselves as the forgotten class left behind by globalization, adrift in a world of lessened national power and forced to the marginal edges of our culture. Democracies, you see what I meant earlier, health and economics are inextricably intertwined, and democracy starts to unwind when there is a threat to prosperity. Germany never survived these threats in the 1930s. You want your historical analogy, folks, Trumplicans? There you go. Sadly, growth is collapsing at the very time more people than ever before in world history are becoming prosperous. In other words, feeding the entitlement mentality. Equally important now, more than ever, people are becoming unaccustomed to being deprived of that prosperity. They've gotten spoiled and decadent. Look up the Tytler scale, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Fear of loss grows exponentially, and the operative word here being fear, emotion, leads to anger. Starting to sound familiar? Fear of loss grows exponentially with the growth of wealth. That is an economic maxim called loss aversion. With greater prosperity comes greater demands on governments to protect that prosperity, and of course, governments can only destroy prosperity. Whether big government, every manifestation of big government, including raising taxes, including pouring on the regulations, including nationalizing entire industries, and including protectionism, which is big government statism. And it doesn't protect anything. It only destroys jobs here at home. The Great Depression was the proof. The Smoot-Hawley tariff, hello. Technology has played a role. At the click of a mouse, anyone can now weigh in on any number of subjects anonymously. As a result, what was once prestigious, politicians, the media, academia, are now seen as obsolete. Today, people view the media as not reporters of news, but as gatekeepers checking opinions for political correctness, something of which Trumplicans are every bit as much guilty as those they accuse of saying. As someone once said, healthy mistrust can quickly turn into pathological contempt. With our elected leaders, people start to question who the leaders really represent, the voters or themselves. Again, you could say that social media has fed the instinct for democracy as opposed to constitutional republicanism. The mob rule, easy to spout off when you're not face to face with the person with whom you're spouting, or with the person at whom you're spouting off. This has created an international backlash against the elite who scolded us that globalization is the only way forward, even though it pretty much is. Whether on the right or left, which is to say the left or left, globalization is always criticized for its lack of democracy, but we've been spoon-fed the belief that we can have it both ways. Globalization and national sovereignty. In fact, you cannot. You cannot negotiate a multinational trade agreement where all the partners have potentially 20 different sets of consumer protection, labor, and environmental laws and fully expect 20 countries to rewrite their laws to conform to the trade agreement. That is a loss of sovereignty and what is fueling the anti-European Union fervor in Europe. It is also what is fueling opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership here. To the left, those other countries are not adapting our laws and protections, the Sanders-Warren view. To the right, which is to say, to the other left, we are surrendering national sovereignty in the name of free trade. Even though you can have... No, I don't agree with Mr. David here on this. You can have national sovereignty and economic freedom. Those two things are not antithetical. They're not antonymical to each other. You can have both of those. So I don't think he's quite right about that. The whole dynamic translates into a national sense of losing control over one's fate. We are at the mercy of forces of evil, mysterious, conspiratorial forces beyond our control, and those forces were set into motion by these so-called elites. If democracy is to be saved, it is not sufficient to state... Now, this is the key, the money shot paragraph here, and this is where the parallel with Germany in the 1930s, Italy in the 1930s, Japan in the 1930s really comes to the fore. Listen to this, folks. Pay close attention. If democracy is to be saved, it is not sufficient to state that there is anger out there. Donald Trump and other strongman leaders are not necessarily manipulating the dynamics, although they really kind of are, but they certainly take advantage of them, which is pretty much the same thing as manipulating. Today, anti-elitism is the new populism, and that is manifested in the rise of the authoritarian leader. Looking at commonalities between these various movements, one can tell they have taken the language of revolt and revolution from the left, which is how you can tell that these movements are also of the left. You know, the existing system is so rigged. You think it's an accident that Trump uses that term? That an alternative is the only answer, and the only alternative is the authoritarian strongman. I mean, think about it. The Weimar Republic. People turned against the Weimar Republic. They were seduced by Adolf Hitler. Why? Because you had communists creating chaos in the streets. Is this sounding familiar? And then you had the ineffectiveness and gridlock of democracy, parliamentary democracy in this case, in the Weimar Republic. And they wanted somebody who would just do what had to be done, get everybody out of the way, let him fix things. And who did that person end up being? Adolf Hitler. Now, am I calling Donald Trump Adolf Hitler? No. Adolf Hitler was the worst imaginable manifestation of that scenario. I'm not saying every strong man is a Hitler. Don't misunderstand me. Although the alt-right, white supremacists, I mean, there is that aspect to Trump and his followers. But I mean, look at the historical parallels with early 1930s Germany. The Weimar Republic, pre-Nazi Germany, is palpable. You know, maybe not Kristallnacht per se, maybe not concentration camps, but the idea of people tired of limited government, wanting, frustrated with the other side, and wanting a strong man to just cut through everything and screw them in revenge. That sounds, it's taken from 2016. Chapter and verse, people. The alternative invariably boils down to the promise of a new political order and governance without compromise or institutional obstructions. It is a bizarre sort of direct democracy filtered through a single person, confirmed by a vote. One man, one vote, once. And then never again. I mean, do you see the wisdom of the Founding Fathers here? Direct democracy. The Founding Fathers didn't give us direct democracy. The Constitution doesn't give us direct democracy. The Founding Fathers didn't trust democracy because they knew in the backdrop of history, democracies always destroy themselves. Follow that Tytler curve again. They always destroy themselves, just like America is in the process of self-destruction as we speak. And then filtered through a single person? Do I even have to say Sieg Heil? The leader says, I feel your pain. Put your trust in me. You will regain power that has been taken from you by the elites. In other words, the people are trading one set of elites for another. Why can't you understand that, Trump supporters? And as an aside, they will say the only way this can be done is through a strong leader who must and shall shatter All those things, elite political parties, the media, the courts, the Washington cartel, etc. What? I've heard Douglas V. Gibbs say it. Trump is wielding a hammer and he's just going to smash everything and burn it all down. And put up what in its place? That's the question Trump supporters are not asking. Put up what in its place? I guarantee you, Trump supporters, it ain't what you think it would be. With the end of the Cold War, there was a false perception that democracy had defeated the last potent opponent of liberty. See, in other words, there were no more enemies outside the gate, but there were the enemies within. We have met the enemy and he is us, to quote Pogo. Only the shape and form of the authoritarian leader has changed. But they never went away because a concrete wall fell in Berlin. Whether we are talking about the United States, Sweden, Hungary, or India, the unspoken question in everyone's mind, and the one that is scary, or should be, is whether we have pushed democracy and liberalization too far. No, that's not the problem. Well, liberalization, that's not the problem. It does not take a genius to step in and answer that question for a susceptible electorate. For false promises of protection, people are becoming willing to surrender liberties. Do you realize that, Trumplicans? Do you realize that by supporting Trump, you are proving yourself willing to give away, to surrender all your liberties for nothing more than the privilege of being a slave on the winning side? I mean, if Trump were to win, only Trump would win. None of his supporters would. It'd all be vicarious for them. Things would get worse under Trump, but they've emotionally invested in him, and so they would continue to defend him, even though he would be governing against their interests. Trump is a paradoxical character. Both, well, no, he ain't no genius. He is not a genius. I mean, he's given to childish speech patterns, lack of knowledge, simplistic solutions to complex matters that aren't solutions at all. His proposals are erratic at best, but and you know what? He has not changed the rules of the game. All you people out there, first of all you people out there throughout the GOP primaries who said, Trump has changed all the rules don't apply to Trump. Yeah, they do apply to Trump, and we're seeing it in this very general election campaign as we predicted from the beginning. Trump hasn't changed anything. He has not changed the rules. The one thing that Trump has changed is to import the left-wing entitlement mentality, the tribalist mentality, into the Republican Party. That's what Trump has done. He hasn't changed the rules. He's just imported the left's mentality inside our gates. Donald Trump is the enemy within, and that makes him far more dangerous than Hillary Clinton could ever be. Today, the more honestly politicians speak about the complexity of issues and their personal limitations, think Paul Ryan, the more they open themselves to attack, because people want easy solutions. People want, the Polaroid culture. People don't want hard solutions. People don't want to be told it's going to be difficult. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a long time. It's not going to turn around magically in one cycle, or in one year, or in one cycle, or in one decade. It's going to be a long, hard task, And we probably will not, even if we could continue the effort, make progress unabated, uninterrupted. Even if we could guarantee we would have all the time we would need to turn the country around, to resurrect the old American Republic, it will take so long that we won't be around to see it. This is something our children and grandchildren will see, if it ever came to fruition. Not going to happen for us. We're getting the process started. And of course, we've seen the effectiveness of arguing about our children and our grandchildren. And where's the national debt again? Knocking on the door of $20 trillion? It's men like Paul Ryan, leaders like Paul Ryan. I'm not necessarily zeroing in on Paul Ryan. He's just serving. He's the highest ranking Republican in the federal government, so he's the guy, the one I'm citing as an example. But it's not just Paul Ryan. God knows. You could say it was any of the other 16 GOP presidential candidates aside from Donald Trump. The Trumplicans have become creatures of the left. Trump supporters have imported the entitlement mentality, the infantile demand that they want what they want, and they want it now! And they don't want to hear about how it can't be done, or it can't be done quickly and immediately, exactly the way they want it. They don't want to hear about reality, about how the other side gets to fight back, about how it's going to be difficult. I mean, they talk about how playing sports teaches young people life lessons. Football is a good example of that, not the only one. In football, you have an offense and a defense. The offense is trying to put the ball in the other team's end zone. The defense is out there to stop them. Now, with that mentality, with the mentality that has now taken over the Republican Party as well as the Democrat Party and is now pretty much functionally universal, you would hear bitching and moaning and whining and complaining. Why do they get to try to stop us? Can't you just get the hell out of the way and let us put the ball in their end zone? Well, that's not the way the game is played, is it? But that's the mentality. That's the mentality that is now universal, and it totally controls both parties. We want what we want it all, and we want it now, and if you tell us we can't have it, then screw you. And thus, Trump mania. I mean, Paul Ryan is considered one of the best politicians when it comes to policy. To continue with that example. In fact, he is considered a policy wonk, thus thrusting himself into the elite category. By the way, a term that is just has been so overused that it's almost as meaningless as the term racist. Oh, he's a racist. That's just an extended middle finger. And that's the same thing with the word elite. That's just a. As leader of the House of Representatives and the GOP, he's the highest-ranking Republican in the federal government, remember. He must also get legislation passed which sometimes involves making deals with the opposition because of his own institutional limitations and the limitations imposed by the electorate. Considering the above, an honest discussion of the complexity of issues coupled with personal and institutional and electoral limitations on getting a full conservative agenda passed, Ryan becomes an obvious target of Trump's strongman leadership rhetoric. Along the way, Trump sees the GOP, epitomized by Ryan, as one of those institutions that must fall, and the Constitution along with it. Because the Constitution doesn't allow for huge radical shifts back and forth in policy unless there is a public consensus behind it. And conservatism does not have that consensus. That has to be earned. You have to persuade people. You have to persuade voters. election after election after election, that is the direction that the country needs to go. You can't just force it on the country. The Trumplicans don't want to hear that. They want their own strong man to get revenge on the other side and the other tribe and force what they want on the country. And the Constitution be damned. And again, where can this lead up? Sieg Heil. Is that really what you want? And you think Hillary is a lesser of two evils? Or greater of two evils, excuse me? James Fallows, a journalist, once noted, quote, liberal democracies like ours depend on rules, but also on norms. Remember how I've said many times on my podcast, Hard Starboard Radio, blogtalkradio.com/HSR Network, and on this very channel, Conservative Ronin playlist, that in order for a constitutional republic to work, everybody must submit to the same set of laws and rules. The rule of law, in other words, not the rule of men or one man. That's what Fallows refers to as norms. On the assumption that you'll go so far but no further to advance your political ends. In other words, the ends do not justify the means when the means are antithetical to the ends. Trump shreds these norms. The very notion that Trump has violated so many norms on so many levels is frightening. It should be frightening to Trump supporters who claim to be constitutionalists. Doug! Most pundits state that Trump has 50 million core supporters who will vote for him. That's 50 million Americans who condone the breaking of these norms, and that is potentially, not potentially at all, that is more frightening. 50 million Americans who, in essence, are no longer Americans. 50 million un-American Americans. And you throw that on top of all the members of the left, and you got over half the country that's un-American. How can, then, the American Republic possibly be resurrected? Trump's commitment to freedoms enshrined in the Constitution is dubious at best. If we assume the worst, and I do, and you should, the Constitution would have no meaning. I mean, it doesn't anyway anymore, but it would get even worse under Trump. Of course, one cannot really follow Trump's train of thought given his stream of consciousness ramblings, but yeah, actually you can. I mean, should Trump, which he won't, but if Trump won the presidency, he would see that victory as a mandate and vindication of his style and his policies, and act accordingly come hell, high water, and the Constitution be damned. That right there should preclude Douglas V. Gibbs supporting Donald Trump. If you're a constitutionalist, you cannot support Donald Trump. Period. Democracy, here's that overused term again, has its flaws for sure, but it's like Winston Churchill said, democracy or constitutional republicanism, whatever, is the worst system of governance in the world except for all the other systems. It's the only system that becomes stronger through internal criticism precisely because it allows it. As democracy becomes more complicated, the more precise that criticism must become. Of course, the more complicated it becomes, the less of a democracy it becomes, but I digress. We cannot revert to simpler times and use old ways of thinking to combat the rise of authoritarianism, because reverting to simpler times and using old ways of thinking lead to the rise of authoritarianism, as we're seeing in the very campaign of Donald J. Trump. When you have governors like Maine's Paul LePage, for example, arguing that we need an authoritarian leader like Trump or a presidential candidate praising the strongman, iron-fisted autocratic rule of dictators like Vladimir Putin, then the words of Nikita Khrushchev ring more true. The Soviet Union will not destroy America. We will destroy ourselves. Nowhere is democracy more entrenched than in the United States, which doesn't have the best of connotations when you understand the subject. We have been a constitutional republic, see the conflation of the terms, for over 2 centuries and have endured many events that would have killed lesser nations. But the rise of a person like Donald Trump and the fact that he will get at least 50 million votes proves that we're no longer a constitutional republic, so I guess democracy is kind of the default term at this point, is a fragile institution. In fact, it died 4 years ago. When the choices at the end were an authoritarian strongman wannabe, a thoroughly corrupt and untrustworthy career politician, and an avowed socialist, and if that is the best our political system can offer, then the prognosis is not just not optimistic, it's conclusive evidence that America as we all knew it is dead and beyond resurrecting.